Food is everywhere. Eating is a universal experience, so it makes sense that it's also a constant in media. It's hard to name a movie or show where food isn't used as a set piece, metaphor, or even in some cases, a fundamental core part of the story. And I find this to be especially true in anime. You've likely seen hundreds of different variations of this tweet. I feel like it's gotten to the point where many animators use food preparation as a way to flex their skills. You may have never even heard of a movie called Garden of Words, but if you're a fan of anime, you've likely seen this scene at some point somewhere on the internet. Yet somehow food is almost always a brief guest star rather than the focus. So what happens when a show comes along and uses food in many fascinating different ways, exploring just how significant and deep it can be? Welcome to the second episode of Dungeon Meshi in Depth. My name is Pei, and today we're talking about Dungeon Meshi's secret ingredient. Season 1 of Dungeon Meshi started airing about a year and a half ago. It's a fantasy story filled with all those classic tropes you associate with that genre. It's heavily inspired by works like Dungeons & Dragons and Lord of the Rings, but this story feels more scientific than fantastic. My roommate once compared it to being on a safari, and at times it feels like a fascinating nature documentary. The primary lens that's used to explore the science behind Dungeon Meshi's magic system is food preparation. There's a whole video to be made about how Dungeon Meshi demonstrates that classic moniker show don't tell isn't the steadfast rule people think it is. It's great practical advice for most writers, especially new ones, but it isn't always true. There are many exceptions where telling can be more interesting than showing. But while that's a very important part of Dungeon Meshi, today that's not the priority. Instead, I want to focus on the significance of food in media and how Dungeon Meshi uses food in so many different fantastic ways. And something I find really interesting is how this is apparent from the very start. So let's take a look at this show's first episode. From the very beginning, food is a central part of this story's plot. We start first with a party of adventurers facing off against a dragon. The main character, Laios, notices that everyone's sluggish, probably a result of a lack of rest and hunger. He has no expectations that they'll lose, and as he focuses on everyone's sluggishness, his mind starts to wander, before his sister pushes him out of the way and ends up getting caught in the dragon's jaw. And in a final effort, she uses magic to teleport everyone out of the dungeon, but she doesn't make it out. This is the main A-plot of the story. This specific dungeon has a magic over it that allows people to be revived. Their souls are tied to their body while they're inside the dungeon, even if they're killed. However, it requires access to resources and the original body. Now, this A-plot doesn't seem super significant in the beginning, just direction for an otherwise episodic kind of gimmicky show, one with a lot of charm and humor. But this plot point is not forgotten. There are plenty of themes in this story about our place within an ecosystem, not above it, demonstrating that even in a dungeon where death isn't necessarily permanent, eat or be eaten is always a possibility. One of many important ways in which Dungeon Meshi uses food. So after losing Phelan, the party finds themselves in a tricky situation. 2 of the 5 remaining members resign. That, in conjunction with the lack of resources including money and food, puts them in a precarious situation. But Laios is determined and quickly measures his options, which it turns out are pretty limited. Marcel and Chilchuk make it clear that they're planning to go back into the dungeon too. And this is where the first restriction comes into play. How will they survive with no food? This brings in another way food is used in this story. It's a tool for passion. Multiple characters feel deeply passionate about preparing or consuming food, but Laios' situation is a little different. He's obsessed with monsters and their anatomy. Inspired by a book he possesses called the Dungeon Food Guide, he's been looking for an excuse to eat one. Apparently the dungeon is a self-sustaining ecosystem, with clear food cycles that some have ventured into studying. So what prevents anyone from eating monsters? Taboo, which is demonstrated in Marcel's strong resistance to eating monsters, and Chilchuk's reluctance to prepare monsters in a room crowded with adventurers. They also sneak in this little line where those who are most known to eat monsters are criminals who refuse to come back to the surface. The fact that it's frowned upon is very intuitive for the audience. The show eloquently makes eating monsters initially unappealing, so when Laios tries to prepare a monster dish for the first time, he quickly realizes his food guide is very limited. Lucky for them, their cooking and conversation attracts the attention of a dungeon-dwelling dwarf named Senshi, who is remarkably familiar with eating monsters. Happy to see others interested in something he's so passionate about, he helps them cook a meal. Now, Dungeon Meshi as a show uses food in many different ways, and this is exemplified perfectly in the first episode. There is a cultural significance in connecting over a meal. It's something probably tied to humans' reliance on the development of culture in its evolution. Food is a necessity, and sharing a meal builds camaraderie. So when Senshi asks to join the group because of their interest in monster cuisine, it's another way that Dungeon Meshi explores the impacts of food in its first episode. All these small examples are explored in much more detail later in the story. And while I don't think any of the examples I've given so far are especially deep or significant, these themes are recurring and evolve. Now, this scene also applies to something I mentioned earlier, the way food preparation is used as exposition to this world's magic system. When Laios is cutting through the mushroom monster, he realizes that it's so much easier to cut vertically rather than horizontally or diagonally, working with, not against the grain. When Marcel is ambushed by a slime, Senshi quickly understands how to kill it, as he's familiar with its anatomy. It's an incredibly grounded, fun way to explore a magical world. So, at this point, we pointed out how food is the central crux of the main A-plot of this story, both in the party's failure because of hunger, and also in Fallon being eaten by the dragon. Food is also a catalyst in this story for people's passions, traumas, and experiences. I pointed at Laios' love for monsters. We talked about food's cultural significance, how sharing meals builds camaraderie and relationships. Demonstrated beautifully multiple times throughout the story, but especially prevalent in the party's meeting of Senshi the dwarf. Food preparation is constantly used to teach the audience about the world's magic system. Magical worlds so often exist in the realm of the fantastic. So to embrace all these classical fantasy tropes and explore them through the lens of ecology and anatomy is really fun, and it feels very fresh. There's an episodic gimmick through the first half of this series that on its own might be enough to be great, but that's not where it stops. The show evolves and tells this epic story, but the thematic importance of food and eating never leaves. But there's one more obvious part of Dungeon Meshi's exploration of food that I want to talk about. Eating the right meal at the right time can be an incredibly cathartic experience, not just helping with physical fatigue, but also emotional and mental exhaustion. There's this podcast I listen to sometimes called Writing Excuses, and somewhat recently they had an episode about using cooking as a metaphor for writing. At one point they bring up that there's a difference between cooking for sustenance and cooking for enjoyment. People have to eat, and often that means making meals because you have to. But sometimes cooking a meal is significant, cathartic, maybe relaxing and therapeutic. There's often big delays between effort and reward. But with meals, it's very immediate and exaggerated. Hunger tends to lead to anticipation. So when a great meal comes together perfectly and you finally sit down and take that first bite, it really hits. There's this cool example of this that I watched a little while back that I want to bring up. Two content creators and streamers, Ludwig Ogren and Michael Reeves, decided to drive from the southern tip of Japan to the northern tip on motorcycles. They gave themselves 2 weeks with tons of time to prepare. They tried to learn Japanese, and it was passable, but far from fluent. The entire thing was fantastic and charming. I had multiple friend groups all around the country watching and keeping up. It wasn't an easy goal. And throughout the journey, the wear and tear started to show. There's an inherent part of content creation that's performative, presentational. The most exaggerated form of this is interviews, where everyone gives a plastic PR answer. But when people have to work through discomfort, that slowly falls away. A great example of this is Hot One interviews, where people are so focused on the spice their walls slowly fall down. Or in this case, 6 days straight of long hours on a motorcycle, without access to phones, internet, or even a map in a country where you don't really speak the language. So on day 7, the episode was titled, "The Best Meal We've Ever Had." This was the first point where they started to face serious cold. And as they headed north, it was only going to get worse. They stopped in a prefecture famous for unagi, and they ended up at this great shop. They were halfway through the trip and they were discussing whether or not they even thought it was possible to make it. Their exhaustion really started to show, and then they got their food, and Michael took his first bite, and he made this face. To me, it felt like they captured this really special moment that we've all experienced, where a great piece of art or a fantastic meal forces you to be present, where you stop worrying about the future or the past and it just pulls you back to now. Food is special, and Dungeon Meshi captures that.